We're back. You are chatting with John P. Today we're going to be talking about some signs that a watch may not be good. I receive questions and comments and emails and phone calls and Instagram direct messages on the real John P. And a frequent question or inquiry that I receive is, hey, John, is this watch XYZ any good? I don't see a lot of information on it, so on and so forth. A lot of similar questions from people, some new to watch collecting, but not always. And these are questions that I tend to avoid because there are just so many brands, so many micro brands, and so many, undiscovered, so to speak, brands. And generally speaking, there are some telltale signs that you can quickly deduce and find out, is the watch any good? Now, good is relative. How do we define that, right? That's an age-old question. But is the watch really a watch that is notable or worth owning, in my opinion, based on these tips and tricks? And also, I'm going to talk about some myths because I think while some of these may seem a little bit more for entry-level watch collectors, it's not always the case, and there are some myths that come with this as well that I'd like to quickly touch on, and I really do hope that this reaches the right people that ask the questions. Oh, also, guys, if there's anything you'd like to see, leave it in the comments below for future videos. Today at Delray Watch, delraywatch.com, where we buy, sell, trade watches. We've had a crazy experience. It's a storm season down here in South Florida. I know I'm sharing a lot here before getting into the real content, but it was unbelievable. We started seeing one of the ceiling tiles, and we're in a pretty nice office building, by the way. Really nice, modern, secure office building. And the ceiling tile starts caving in, and the printer where we print all the labels for the shipping, and that's something that we cannot go without because we won't be able to make shipments for all of you out there that are buying or selling watches with us. I see water start collecting on it. I look up, the ceiling tile is caving in, and it turns out we have some type of leak, I think, from the air conditioning unit. Something has sprung a leak. And so, literally on the outside of this glass panel that I have here in the little studio we have set up, there is water coming from the ceiling. And we're waiting for the I guess the plumber to come out here, or the repair people that will help us with that. But it was funny because Federico, if you know him, Federico Talks Watches, before it caved in, Federico was poking it with a broomstick, not quite causing the damage, but I don't know, prodding with it. I'm not sure what he was doing, but he hits it and the water sprays everywhere. I hear it screaming like, ah! And now we have this kind of this leak. So something we're tackling, but a video here because it's been a while. So the first myth, let's talk about the myths first of things that are not necessarily mean the watch is bad, is the region. I think, there are some people that maybe have been collecting for a while, or they're not totally wrapped up into watches, where they've maybe overlooked watches from different regions in the world. Let's say parts of Asia. Namely and predominantly, let's talk about, some Chinese watches or some Japanese watches. I think there was a period of time, decades ago where, it was kind of synonymous with not being of quality, but now we get brands like Grand Seiko and Seiko, for that matter, that really have very high standards for what they are, luxury watches, or watches if we're talking about Seiko. So I think region, right off the bat, we have to get rid of that. So if you see a watch pop up in, I don't know, Venezuela or something, I mean, okay, but extreme example, but let's say you see that, it doesn't necessarily mean the watch is bad. I think region is no longer on the list, and that's why it's a myth. Next, we have sapphire crystals. So the actual material that is covering the dial of the watch that you see there, that some people refer to the glass, or what covers what some people refer to as the face. There was a period of time, I want to say 10, 15 years ago, where if it didn't have sapphire, it just wasn't nice. Some brands that were notable brands still hadn't crossed over from mineral glass into sapphire. And so with it did not come some of the properties of sapphire, such as the scratch resistance, and some things like AR coating, anti-reflective coating that sapphire can allow you to place and have really good benefit there, obviously to prevent reflection. And also it's more hard. Arguably, it can be brittle in certain circumstances, but it's more hard than the mineral crystal. But that's not always the case now, because you have some brands that are even going with that vintage inspired feeling that have started using kind of like the Hesselite or different types of plastics for the crystals. And it doesn't necessarily mean that if the watch doesn't have sapphire anymore, it's not a great watch, just because, watches are starting to kind of pull from the history and make things that are nostalgic or take advantage of some interesting benefits of having a Hesse-like crystal, such as the ability to polish it easily and have it look like new. So not always, definitely a myth there on that one. Next, we have having an Etta or Selena movement. Same with the others. There was a time where I want to say maybe this one is closer to 7 or 8 years, so not that long ago, where if it just had an Etta or a Selena, it was completely just dismissed as being a quality watch. A lot of watches had them, but this is where you started seeing brands start developing in-house movements and in-house. Now, I would argue, and I make previous videos, I won't talk all day about it, that in-house doesn't mean that much when you see brands start investing together and building workshops that make the movements, and you see companies that own the brands start buying movement manufacturers. I mean, you saw it, in the earliest days with Blancpain, you saw it from brands that just bought watch manufacturers, called it in-house because they bought a movement manufacturer. So having an Etta or a Selena in and of itself is not a bad thing. In fact, I like it. It's a workhorse movement. Wouldn't you want something proven to work for decades in your watch? So I'll talk more about that because there is something about the movement that is a telltale sign of a watch that's probably not great that I'll talk about later. And lastly, on a myth is the weight. I see it I think even yesterday, someone left a comment that said, oh, the Omega watch is just, one particular Omega watch is lighter than this other particular Rolex, so the Omega is worse. Well, it might feel not as great on some people's wrists, but the weight doesn't mean a whole lot. There's different types of metals, there's different types of steel, even, when you start talking about titanium, there's different things in terms of the construction of the bracelet, how thick is it, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the watch is better because it's heavier. Now, if you're looking for as heavy a watch as possible, yeah, the heavier watch is going to be better based on that requirement alone. But if you're just looking for an overall great watch, having a heavier watch doesn't really do anything for it besides make it heavier. Now that we've gotten all of these myths out of the way that I just had to mention, let's talk about some signs, some telltale signs. Watches, let's pretend a watch came in through the door at Del Rey Watch, never heard of it. Some of these here are going to be telltale signs, and we even joke about these sometimes. The first one is the packaging. Now, there are some brands. I'm not going to name a brand. I'm not going to give you a specific brand. I don't like to necessarily pinpoint one brand and have a bit of a negative parade on them. But the brands, and if you find one, make sure to check this one out. If the watch comes with a ton of trinkets and toys and the packaging is super nice and fancy, that is oftentimes a telltale sign that the watch is lackluster. Now, it might not be a horrible watch, but generally speaking, I have found that a watch brand is overcompensating for something by having something that's super shiny and fancy when it comes to the packaging. You can see some really great watches out there that in fact don't come with great packaging. I mean, even if you want to talk about Nomos, when Nomos came out, they shipped their watches in these boxes that seemed like they were, maybe $1 at your local craft store. I think they've upped the quality a little bit. I think the modern day Nomos, some of them come, I want to say, in like a leather roll or a travel pouch. I have to refresh myself. It's been a while since I bought a new Nomos, but they used to come in these like dollar boxes, and I was blown away because they were really well respected to this day, surely. But in that price point, having those movements, those in-house movements, the Alpha caliber, they were shipping their watches in a dollar box. And so you do see some, I'm not going to say a brand that does something, but look for the brands that come with little toys, little cars, little NFT tokens and things like that. The brands. I don't have to talk about this all day. This one grinds my gears though, because I want to watch. I don't want a toy set. I don't want a Lego set. I don't want to have to set up a little figurine display on my desk. I want to wear the watch. Next one, I know. Unsigned movement or movement from another brand. Now this one is going to be shocking for some. I know it. When I saw this, I'm not going to say the brand, but there was one particular watch that we purchased directly from a brand through their distributor. They had to move it, And the watch actually, when we opened it up, had a rotor that was signed by another brand. There's going to be people in the comments that are going to call this one out and say, no, it's not happening. No, I'm not saying this was a well-known and notable brand. They were a Swiss brand, but they're not really well known or notable. This is probably not a brand that many of you have in your, I mean, almost certainly many of you don't have in your collection. Maybe one or two people out there. So I wouldn't be worried about this one. Trust me, most brands would never be caught dead with another rotor with another brand on it. But it's something we saw in the under, I think, $1,500 price point range. You do see this, trust me. But oftentimes you see the movements just unsigned. So some brands, even Panerai, in the earliest of times, the Panerai Brooklyn Bridge watch that didn't even have a signature on the rotor, and they took a lot of flack for that. Panerai did. Now, I mean, it was a base movement anyways, but people really like the fact that the brand at least puts the brand name on it, right? You crack open the hood of an automobile, the engine should probably have the brand name somewhere on that. Certainly not the brand name of another company, but no brand name at all is a little weird, right? It should have it. It's nice. You paid a lot of money for it. So if the watch doesn't even... if the brand doesn't even take the time to sign the rotor, this is another one that says, come on, this is so cheap and lazy of the brand to do this. They're really pinching the pennies here and keeping the difference in their pocket at the expense of the collector, because anyone that doesn't sign the movements just really doesn't care about the brand, or they're pulling a fast one. Doesn't mean that Panerai didn't do it about face. I don't believe that either, but you get the picture. Next, we have, with the movements, unregulated movements. There are some brands out there, including micro brands, that just don't regulate the movements. Now, when you regulate a movement, you have multiple positions, right? When you wear a watch, depending on how the watch is positioned, the movement runs a little bit differently just because there's mechanical pieces, things move depending on the position, the weight, so on and so forth. That's how it works. By the way, on the wrist today, vintage 1972 Rolex 1016 Frogfoot dial. Been a while since I had this one on the wrist. It's a fun vintage Rolex. So regulated movements means that the watchmaker is adjusting the mechanics of the movement for timekeeping in... You'd want it to be in more than one position because that's how you're wearing the watch. It depends on who's doing it, but that's generally it. There's many positions of the watch that it can be done in, and some brands will just not do it. They'll take a stock movement, or maybe they'll regulate it in one position, maybe dial up, dial down, something like that. And that's problematic because they'll say, hey, this watch is keeping chronometer spec. It's probably not going to be, it's almost certainly not going to be rated as a chronometer, but they'll say, we keep specs within, so many seconds per day. And it was in maybe one position, or it was on the movement before it went in the case. And you see this generally in watches that are more low priced, but theoretically it could happen at any time, even a more expensive watch. Now, I'm not saying that, JLC or AP is going to do this, because that would be absolutely unbelievable and blasphemy. But when you start getting into some of these micro brands, especially with low budgets and not great access to watchmakers, which are in very high demand right now, watchmakers, it's really difficult to get a really great watchmaker. They're just not, taking the time, they're assembling these watches with very entry-level, rudimentary skill watchmakers. So they don't regulate it in multiple positions. And in my opinion, that's just not a great watch, because you want the watch to keep good time if it is a brand new modern watch. And with the components and the quality, we have the straps. This one also, I really don't like it when you get a watch, and whether it's a nice watch or, just a watch in general, and it has a bad strap. When you wear a watch with a leather strap, or even a rubber, a silicone strap, it adds a lot of the feel to the wrist, right? You can wear a watch on a strap. It's going to feel different than a bracelet, different types of straps, the interior leather of the strap. How that watch feels on your wrist is going to change depending on this. And some brands only focus on the watch case. They only focus on that particular thing, and they don't really focus on what you're wearing it on, right? It's like if you bought a brand new Ferrari and they put, these clearance special tires somehow. I mean, I know they're not going to fit, but you get these chunky clearance special all-season tires that are not well made, and you throw it on it. That would be kind of the same thing. And I think a brand that is even more affordable could just put a higher quality strap. I mean, we're talking a wholesale cost to a brand of like maybe $15 to $20 for a high quality non-alligator strap, just like something like a calf leather. They could buy a high quality strap for $15, $20. I know, because we do the same thing. We get nicer straps sometimes when we're putting it on a watch, because we know that it adds a lot of the wearability to the watch is a nice strap, not even the presentation, but the feeling. Some brands just cheap out. They want to save the $5, $10, whatever it is, and get a watch strap that would be, $7 wholesale their cost or less. And I can't believe it, because people would actually like their product a little bit more if it came on a better watch strap. And then to top it off, people have to go and search on the internet to buy these watch straps, because they know they wear the watch like, this strap feels a little bit cheap. Let me find something better. And they have to pay a premium price where it could have just been baked into the product, gave the consumer a better lasting impression of the overall product and not just that watch. My opinion, what do you guys think about straps? Leave it in the comments below. I know a couple years ago I mentioned, maybe start a watch strap brand, kind of toying with that idea again, because I see the same thing is that, dealers and those in the industry have really great access to high quality straps, but they're not widespread. Most of these manufacturers want to work with dealers only. So what do you guys think about straps? Comments below. Next, look out for the warranty and service centers. When a brand doesn't really clearly state how they handle the service and warranty, especially if it's a brand that's not well known. Once again, not talking Holy Trinity, not talking well-known brands that everyone loves and praises and wears, and not talking about those brands, but something new. You're like, hey, is this a good brand? If they don't really talk about how they're going to service their watches, where you can send them, they don't talk about the warranty, or they say something very, very vague as this, as a watch brand, a watch manufacturer, that's something you should watch out for, because you've seen this happen with watch brands that even were respected at one point in time. Think of Cobalt. If you're not familiar with Cobalt, they're a watch company that was based out of, I believe, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, or one of the cities in Pennsylvania. I think they had a couple of offices. I think the guy's name was Michael Kobold, and he had a really big problem. I mean, more than a big problem. I guess there was a lot of conspiracies surrounding, where some funds maybe went. There's a story, there's a whole thread on the Watch You Seek forum. I won't get too far into that. But there was an issue with this huge backlog, apparently, of watch services. And these were watches that were a few $1,000s. And I've held a few of them. I thought the case construction was pretty great. I think it's Fricker was the German company that was maybe making some of their cases for a while, or Ickler, one of those. They had some connection there, but they actually had pretty well made cases. The watches were okay. I think we had a few at Delray Watch a couple years ago, and so I was kind of impressed for the price point. They were one of the original micro brands that did a pretty great job, but they fell short on the service and the warranty. Many people were up in arms. I think they ran into financial problems because, as you know, let's say the watch comes back for repair, they have to be hiring a watch repairman. They have to be hiring a watchmaker, at least someone that can fix the problem. And if there's a real problem with the movement, then you have to buy the movements, and that has a financial cost, and that relies on the brand to be making forward sales so that they can pay for the watches that were sold in the back. And that just didn't happen for them. They ran into a problem, and they had a real big issue on the internet. If you're got some free time, you want to kind of find out. I think there was a blogger or a writer who spent a lot of time looking at business filings. Look it up, the Kobold. I personally am not calling it a scam, but others are calling it the Kobold scam. You can read all about it, and interesting how it turned into for a while like a travel. I think it was like a travel service in Nepal. Pretty wild story. I don't know how much of it is true, but nonetheless, they ran into a service problem. So make sure to know who's going to take care of the watch, especially when it comes down to case parts and things that really only the manufacturer can supply for you. Next, there is a lot of focus on trashing the big names and competitors. This is a deal breaker for me. When I see a brand, it doesn't matter if it's a watch brand or any other brand of anything. This could be a toothpaste brand. If the brand is coming out and saying, we're not like, company ABC, we're company XYZ, and, we're cheaper, we're better, we're leaner, we're meaner, we don't do all those other bad things that all those other people do, and they're completely targeting, the big names in the industry to kind of like generate some buzz and PR, that's a deal breaker for me, because it means that they have something that they're trying to either hide, or it means that they're trying to take direct shots and trying to take business from those people. And in my opinion, it just doesn't really work. You see some companies out there that do this with tourbillons. You see some companies out there that do this with, I don't want to give the name, but there's like kind of like a car, like an exotic car watch brand. And you even have some YouTubers that are really liking this. Now, I haven't held those watches, if you know what it is. I haven't held it in my hands, but when they say, hey, we're so much better and cheaper, it makes me kind of scratch my head. Is that really true? I don't know if it's true, but if they don't have the brand recognition, which they don't because they're trying to steal some from those competitors, they're not really going to last a long time. So that's a telltale sign. It's not 100% guaranteed, but it's something that I see watch brands do, is saying, we're transparent. I've heard that really beating a dead horse with the transparent, better, cheaper, stronger kind of scenario. Next, there is no one really talking about the brands. Now, this is probably one of the most popular questions I do receive outside of the ones that I've already covered. I'll get a question and it'll say, hey, I've discovered this brand. Is it any good? And sometimes I do look at the brand and it will be something that is produced. They'll take like a stock model off of Alibaba or AliExpress or Rakuten or one of those other sites where, kind of international trade sites, and they'll slap a name on it. Maybe they'll change up a color combo, but they'll use one of these, these manufacturers that make really cheap watches, and they'll present it kind of all right and nice. And there might even be some really positive reviews on YouTube and Instagram. But generally speaking, these are really not great brands. I mean, they compete in the price point of a Seiko, and at the price point of a Seiko, you really can't get any better than a Seiko because Seiko has all the production in-house. They're totally vertically integrated. You're going to get technically an in-house movement that is worked over, and they're really proven. They have the economies of scale, and none of these other competitors are. Sometimes they'll use a Seiko movement, for an added benefit, but how can they supply a Seiko movement that's going to be cheaper than the manufacturer that has, the biggest production value and capabilities? It's just not going to be beat when you're one of these very undiscovered brand. And so once again, I scratch my head at these as well. The answer is always no, probably not a great brand. You might love the watch, the design, hey, whatever, but I wouldn't spend serious money, whatever you think that is. I wouldn't do it. And also be careful with YouTube reviews. Keep in mind that when you go on the internet represents the world, and with the world comes paid reviews and paid product placement. So you do have to be careful. This is happening maybe outside of generally watch YouTube channels. You'll see this a lot on like comedy shows. You'll see the Vinceros. You'll see these kind of brands that will maybe get their foot in the door of some watch YouTubers for a quick buck grab, but usually it's maybe a men's fashion channel, something like that. So generally speaking, avoid these watches if you're looking for like kind of like an enthusiast grade collector, really, really quality watch, and it's not just about kind of how it looks for you. Next, and lastly, really bad website. This kind of takes us back into the packaging, the toys, the trinkets, and how the product is displayed. The brand kind of plays more on the lifestyle and the feeling more so than the product. So when we talk about watches, we're watch geeks, we're collectors. Generally, if we're on here talking and watching watch videos, we like the watches more than all the other things that come with it. And when you see a really bad website, that's a horrible sign, by the way, because it means that the brand probably doesn't have a lot of money. Now, I'm not saying at delraywatch.com we have the best website in the world, but then again, we're selling other people's watches that are proven to be good, right? We're selling AP, Rolex. I mean, we don't need to convince anyone that these are really great products. But when you start getting into brands that make their own watches, the ones that really do have a great website means they have some funding behind them. So you can see something like a Ming, they have a pretty good website. You see some other brands very similar, they have a pretty great website. But when you go there, it looks like it's 1998. Things don't work. There's misspelling. That is always a red flag for me. Now, not 100% of the time is that the case, because I'll say that Habring has kind of an antiquated, outdated website, but it's a husband and wife, and they really are just focusing on knocking out these watches because they have back orders, as my understanding. So it's not 100% of the time, but when you start, I think you can see is when you start mixing and matching these things, it really builds the case either for or against the watch or the watch brand in question, right? If there's all these toys, trinkets, toy cars, little things, winders, bracelets, NFT plugin chip tokens, and then you start seeing bad strap, all these other things. Well, you have to scratch your head, and you can rest assured that the watch is probably not great. What do you guys think? Are there any brands out there that are very, very guilty of doing some of these things? I'd love to hear it in the comments below. Also, are there any other watches or brands that are kind of surprisingly very successful or reputable that are also guilty of these things? I'd love to hear your opinions and comments down below. Thanks, guys. You've been chatting with John P. Ciao. Now I have to go see if we are underwater.